physical goods cross borders every second. For decades, the classical assumption in international economics has been that the bilateral flow of these goods smoothly dictates the value of the currencies exchanged between trading partners. This logic forms the foundation of producer currency pricing, the first-generation macroeconomic model rooted in the Mundell-Fleming framework. The core mechanic of this model relies on a specific friction. Export prices are sticky in the producer's currency. Because of this stickiness, an exchange rate depreciation directly and immediately lowers the relative price of that producer's goods in foreign markets. A second-generation alternative, known as local currency pricing, offered a different mechanism. It assumes prices are sticky in the destination market's currency, which mutes any immediate exchange rate effects for the final consumer. Both of these classical models rely on a shared mathematical assumption: symmetry. They assume a currency's use in global trade scales linearly with that specific nation's physical export volume. By treating currency use as a symmetric byproduct of physical trade, entire generations of central bank policies were built on an equation that fails to accurately predict real-world macroeconomic shocks. Modern transaction-level customs data reveals a severe disconnect. Global currency use is wildly disproportionate to actual physical export volumes. The macroeconomic framework that resolves this anomaly is the dominant currency paradigm, heavily detailed in the research of economists like Geeta Gopinath. The central pillar of this framework is that the vast majority of global trade, 91%, is invoiced in a single vehicle currency, the US dollar. This holds true even when the United States is entirely absent from the transaction. This creates extreme asymmetry in the global system. The dollar's share in export invoicing is multiples higher than the actual United States' share of world trade. The euro also functions with powerful asymmetry, but primarily as a regional dominant currency for European trade, rather than a truly global vehicle. Because the US dollar serves as the global pricing vehicle, it breaks the classical mechanics of exchange rate pass-through. This reality changes how we track monetary shocks as they transmit across borders. If trade prices are sticky in dollars instead of local currencies, how does that alter exchange rate pass-through when a nation's currency depreciates? This matrix maps transmission into aggregate prices. Under producer currency pricing, when a currency depreciates, the terms of trade deteriorates. Under the dominant currency paradigm, it remains perfectly stable. The zero reflects that prices are locked in the dominant currency. We can verify this theoretical prediction using global transaction-level regression data that tracks trade price elasticity. Traditionally, a bilateral exchange rate dictated import price inflation. The bilateral coefficient stands at 0.76, but when the US dollar is introduced, it drops to 0.16. The dollar absorbs the entire impact. The cross-country variation in this pass-through effect is directly proportional to a specific nation's propensity to invoice its imports in dollars. Under the dominant currency paradigm, your bilateral exchange rate with your trading partner is practically irrelevant. Your import inflation is overwhelmingly dictated by your exchange rate against the US dollar. Moving from prices to quantities, we have to ask how rigid dollar pricing alters expenditure switching, the mechanism that is supposed to naturally rebalance a struggling economy. This table maps transmission into aggregate quantities. Traditionally, currency depreciation triggers a boom in exports because goods become cheaper globally. But because exporter prices are locked in dollars, buyers never see a price drop. The expected export surge is neutralized. For emerging markets, this establishes a harsh macroeconomic reality. Expenditure switching happens almost exclusively through the painful compression of domestic imports, with no corresponding export boom to offset the pain. This leads directly to the macro spillover effect. If all rest-of-world trade is invoiced in dollars, we have to calculate the outcome of the dollar appreciating against everyone simultaneously. This equation defines that specific spillover. It calculates the inverse relationship between the US dollar exchange rate and total non-US global trade volumes. A strong dollar artificially inflates the domestic price of imports everywhere. This simultaneously depresses demand across all non-US borders. This contractionary force is precise. A 1% appreciation of the US dollar mechanically predicts a 0.6% contraction in rest-of-world trade. The US dollar acts as a global macroeconomic environment. A strong dollar is a mechanical, contractionary shock to the entire global trade network, operating independently of the US business cycle. We have to view this through the perspective of a central bank in a small open economy trying to set optimal monetary policy. Under traditional models, central banks operate with what economists call divine coincidence. This is the theoretical ability to stabilize inflation and completely close the output gap at the exact same time. Divine coincidence works under producer currency pricing because the exchange rate perfectly modulates the terms of trade. The central bank can effectively manipulate foreign demand for its own exports. This graph maps the impulse response to a monetary shock. Dashed lines represent predicted behavior under the classical model, but plotting the reality of dollar dominance shows a stark divergence. Inflation spikes much higher, while export quantity remains flat and unresponsive. Because export prices are preset in the dominant currency, the terms of trade become completely exogenous. The central bank loses its lever to manipulate export demand. The economy now has two sticky prices: domestic prices in local currency and export prices in dollars. But the central bank only has one policy tool. It is mathematically impossible to close both output gaps simultaneously. So, what is the mathematically optimal response for a central bank trapped in this paradigm? Policymakers must completely abandon the export gap. They have to allocate their single policy tool entirely to targeting domestic producer price inflation. Conditional on stabilizing those domestic prices, the optimal policy requires allowing the exchange rate to float rather than expending resources to rigidly peg it. Even with mathematically optimal policy execution, central bankers must accept that they cannot insulate their real economy from the volatility of global dollar shocks. This friction is incredibly persistent. Currency choices are driven by firm-level strategic complementarities. Exporters price in dollars because their suppliers and competitors do the same. These highly rational micro-decisions lock the global equilibrium in place for generations. As long as the dominant currency paradigm holds, the US dollar remains the central pricing instrument of the international system, forcing every other nation to navigate an economic reality they do not control.